Okay, we're live on Twitter, we're live on Instagram, and I believe we're also live on YouTube. Can you drop some comments in the chat if you can hear us?
Looks like we're good, Rami.
We are good. Okay. Sorry, apologies, folks, for the two YouTube stream lives that we have on the YouTube channel. I had some issues with StreamYard scheduling the calls. Turns out that when you click on creating a live stream, it immediately sets it for now. So apologies for everyone who were waiting from 2 p.m. and on. We are live. We have a couple of people chiming in. So as we are getting into 2025, there's been a lot of things going on in the world, just like every other year. But with Trump's inauguration coming in, I think it's extremely important to look at what could we expect for 2025. We had Joe Biden's mandate that ended up with multiple wars in, Ukraine, Russia, in West Asia, going from Yemen, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and of course the continuous hostilities on Taiwan from the West. So as we brace ourselves for Trump's mandate coming in January, we have a lot of places that we need to keep tabs on, such as in Ukraine, where right now ATACMS are being used to target Russian cities. Long-range weapons being approved by the West to keep putting pressure on Russia, as well as the Kursk attack, counterattack, whatever you want to call it, that is basically coming to an end right now. So we need to keep tabs on what's going to be Trump's policy in Ukraine, as well as in West Asia, with the recent fall of Bashar al-Assad and the current sectarian divide. And there's still some partisan warfare happening in Syria right now in Alawite communities, Druze communities, and of course with the Kurdish-backed area, the SDF. So we need to, we have Dimitri, I think we have a lot to say about how things are going to develop in West Asia and just even beyond Syria, right? And Lebanon and Yemen. We note that Israel has been targeting Yemen, attacking the airport, nearly killing the World Health Organization chief. And then we're going to be covering as well what will Trump's policy be vis-a-vis China. We note that during the first mandate from Trump, Trump was very quick to position China as its biggest rival, more so than Russia. And we've seen lots of claims of Uyghur genocide. And I think there was also the Hong Kong Parliament uprising, or, for lack of a better word, I'm not sure how to best describe that. So there's a lot to keep track of as well in China, right? Especially with the status of Taiwan and with the growing semiconductors industry. And then with the most recent claims of the United States that Canada would be a good 51st state, or 52nd if we consider Israel 51st state. So the possible annexation of Canada, which is where Dimitri and I are based out of, and of Greenland and possibly Panama, right? So there's lots to discuss of anticipating Trump's inauguration. Dimitri, how do you want to start it? Should we dive in straight into Ukraine, or do you have any words to begin? Oh, well, first of all, just before we begin, it's also important to talk about the holiday season. Dimitri and I are super grateful for everyone that has been tuning into our live stream every week. So happy holidays to all of you. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Orthodox Christmas as well for those celebrating on the 7th of January. Yeah, Dimitri.
And happy Hanukkah. This is, we as Rami said, we greatly appreciate our interactions with our audience, and the growth in our subscriber base has been really encouraging. And although, as we're going to be discussing, there's a lot to be concerned about in the year ahead, we also remain hopeful and positive about the prospects for humanity, for the prospects for a better world. And we wish you every success, peace, and joy in the coming year. I guess before we begin, we're going to focus first on the Ukraine war and Russia. But perhaps, Rami, we should start with some general observations so people kind of understand how we're going to approach this task, this very, treacherous task of trying to predict what Donald Trump is going to do, particularly in a world where there's so much volatility, so much instability, and the surprises just won't stop coming. So this is a difficult task under the best of circumstances, and the circumstances are particularly challenging now for making reliable predictions about what the next president of the United States is going to do. And one thing I want to stress is, although the president of the United States has long been talked about in the public discourse in the West as a person who's omnipotent, the most powerful leader in the world, of the most powerful state in the history of mankind and all the rest of it, the powers of the U.S. president are actually quite limited, constrained for a variety of reasons. So although it's going to be quite important how Trump reacts to the various crises around the world and what others he might generate, and certainly the fact that the U.S. has as much economic power and military power as it continues to possess is something that has the potential to wreak great havoc. We shouldn't overestimate either the power of the United States presidency to shape events. The second thing I want to say is, from my perspective, and I suspect that Rami will agree, the best indicator of future behavior is past conduct. You are, as I've said many times, what your record says you are. And in the case of Donald Trump, we have the benefit of 4 years in the White House already behind us. And we also have had some time since he last left office to assess the impacts of the decisions that he made on a foreign policy basis. So it's a pretty good body of evidence to go on, but it also is an imperfect indicator, your record, because you change, people change, people make mistakes, they realize their mistakes, circumstances change, and you may, as the leader of a country, find yourself in uncharted territory. You kind of have to make things up as you go along. So your record is not by any means an ironclad indication of how you will behave in the future. That's true of anybody. It's not just true of Donald Trump. But it's probably the best place to start. And I think it matters a hell of a lot more what you've actually done when you were previously in that position as president than what you say you're going to do. As we have seen over and over again, Donald Trump takes great liberties with the truth, as do all U.S. presidents, frankly. I don't know that he's any more dishonest than Joe Biden was, but the record reflects quite clearly that his stated intentions oftentimes turn out to be very different from what he does in practice. So again, let's focus in our discussion on the record, but realizing the limitations of this approach. So with that, do you have anything to add as to our general approach to this subject, Rami, before we take on the subject of Ukraine and Russia?
Well, just a tiny thing is that as much as, you've mentioned it, right? Trump has limited powers, the president of the United States have limited powers, but the United States as a whole also has limited powers. They have the power of destroying the world, but they've lost in Vietnam. The resistance is always able to keep them in check. We've had terrible years in the United States, but the resistance is always stronger than ever. And they were able to, just Cuba alone during the Bay of Pigs invasion was able to repel. So we have track records. So it's not about us lying to ourselves to stay motivated. It's that history has taught us that the Americans are it's a paper lion, right? Or paper tiger? Dimitri, correct me with the expression. Paper tiger. So
either animal would be fine, I think, in this context.
We're focusing on what Trump is able to do, what he thinks he will be able to do, but we know that the final word belongs to those who are resisting to American hegemony every day.
It belongs to all of humanity. And Trump is just one significant actor in all of this, but we all have a role to play. Very well said, Rami. So let's turn to the subject of Ukraine and Russia. And of course, the headline has been for months on end that Trump is focused on bringing the war in Ukraine to an end. There's been a lot of discussion about that. But again, before we talk about whether he really is going to do that, whether he can do it, and under what circumstances he might do it, let's look at his record with respect to Ukraine. It was a common refrain during Trump's first term in office that he was soft on Russia. His critics went much further than that. They claimed that he was actually a puppet of Putin, that Putin had some kind of compromised tapes on him, that he was enthralled to Putin, he worshipped Putin. I mean, every manner of really nonsense was directed at Trump and his relationship to Russia by the Democrats and by people in the Republican Party who were unhappy for a variety of reasons with Donald Trump's presidency. But I would suggest to you that this whole notion of Trump being soft on Russia in his first term is not at all borne out by the record. So let's first of all look at his policy with respect to providing weapons to Ukraine. So Rami, could you please pull up image 1?
Yeah.
So you'll see here, this is a package of lethal weaponry that the Trump administration authorized in 2019. So this is 3 years before Russia's military intervention in Ukraine in February of 2022. And what in this particular package, he authorized the use of sniper rifles and electronic warfare gear services. These are obviously things that can be employed not only for defensive purposes, but for offensive purposes. Now, if you could pull up image 2, Rami. So that's that's a package that was approved in 2019 by the Trump administration.
Do you see it on screen, Dimitri?
Yes. And so here you'll see another package, a more significant one, which was approved 2 years previously by the Trump administration. These were Javelin anti-tank weapons. These were sent to Ukraine in 2017. And these were, in fact, used, according to reports in the Western media, to quite damaging effect by Ukrainian forces in the early weeks of the military intervention in February 2022. You may recall images of Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers and trucks lined up on a highway from Ukraine's northern border down to Kiev. I read a number of reports at the time that javelins were being used to inflict very serious damage on those vehicles and on Russian forces. So this is not just something that was theoretically used to lethal effect. It actually was used to lethal effect after Trump took office, after Trump left office, I should say. So could we go to image 3, Rami?
Yeah.
Now, here, this is from the article on the javelins, the anti-tank missiles that were sent. If you look down there, we've highlighted in blue. This is a commentary by Senator Tom Cotton, and it's noted that Obama never approved the transfer of lethal weaponry, but Trump did. Obama bears considerable blame for the current disaster in Ukraine because it was under his administration that the U.S. and Britain helped to orchestrate the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, the democratically elected, albeit flawed president of Ukraine in 2014. And we've mentioned many times that there was even a recording. Probably it came from Russian intelligence. They captured a conversation between Victoria Nuland, who was at that time a senior official in the U.S. State Department, and Jeffrey Pyatt, who was at that time the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, in which they're basically selecting the next prime minister of Ukraine weeks before the president was overthrown. And that man did, in fact, become prime minister. His name was Yatsenyuk, whom she referred to in the conversation as Yats. She said, Yats is our guy. In any event, at least Obama didn't have he had the foresight not to provide weaponry to Ukraine. And he said basically that the reason is Russia has escalation dominance in this context. And if they get into a hot war, it's very likely to turn out badly for Ukraine. He was absolutely right about that. And Trump simply disregarded that policy and began arming the Ukrainians. So can we go on to image number 4, please, Rami?
Yep.
Now, in addition to providing weapons to Ukraine, something that's not discussed much nowadays is that Trump also imposed various sanctions on Russia. So this set of sanctions was enacted, I believe it was. If you just bear with me for one moment. So this was signed into law in August 2017, relatively early in Trump's first term. It not only, this law levied new sanctions against Russia, this law, which Trump did not veto, restricted Trump's own ability to ease sanctions that were in place against Moscow. So that's how committed Donald Trump was from the very beginning of his first term to imposing economic sanctions on Russia. Can we now go to image number 5, Rami?
Is that the one?
I don't see it up on the screen yet. Yes. So this is another round of sanctions. This took place, I can barely see the year there. I think was that 2019, Rami? In any event, so you'll see that this was a policy that Trump pursued throughout his presidency. It wasn't just at the very beginning. And could we go to image number 6? This, by the way, what you're about to see is a BBC article from 2019, which reports on Trump's imposition of sanctions on the Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. And you'll see at the bottom here, it's quite interesting to go back not so long ago, 2019, and read how the Western press was reporting the relationship or the importance of Nord Stream to the European economy. And you'll see at the bottom there, it says the U.S. considers the project, this is the BBC, the U.S. considers the project a security risk to Europe, not to the United States apparently, but to Europe. But both Russia and the EU strongly condemned the U.S. sanctions. So the Europeans were not at that point in time in agreement with Trump that this was a security risk to them. And if they don't consider it a security risk to them, how could it possibly make sense for the U.S. government to be imposing sanctions on the pipeline on the basis that it imposes or it creates a security risk to Europeans? They themselves didn't see it as a security risk at that time. They viewed it as being quite important to their economic well-being. And it turned out to be correct. It was quite important to their economic well-being. And the other thing here, about this sanctions policy or this package of sanctions on Nord Stream, it shows that there has been a continuity of policy with respect to Europe's reliance on Russian energy throughout several administrations. This goes all the way back even before Obama. The American government has always hated the idea that Europe would be in a relationship, an energy relationship with Russia. They claimed, you know, as Trump did here, that this was a security risk to Europe because the Russians might use the provision of energy to gain leverage over them. But really what I think quite clearly was motivating their fixation on the Nord Stream pipeline was that this cheap Russian gas, if it was bought in large quantities by Europe, was going to strengthen the economies of both Europe and Russia, whereas the United States government wanted to weaken them both. Well, it succeeded in weakening the economy of Europe, and terribly so, but it hasn't weakened the economy of Russia. Russia has found other buyers for its oil and gas, you know, including, but not limited to, China and India. So this turned out to be a disastrous policy, and it is one that was consistent across administrations for many years in the United States. So that's the sanctions policy that Trump pursued. Now let's go to image 7. This is another significant aspect of the Trump administration's policies towards Ukraine and Russia. Not only were they providing lethal weaponry to Ukraine under the Trump administration, not only were they imposing various rounds of sanctions, but in addition, they were engaging in quite provocative military exercises in Ukraine with the Ukrainian military. And you'll see that this one here was called Rapid Trident. That sounds like, you know, an offensive military exercise if ever one did. And I just want to read to you some of the text here from the bottom of this this article. And it wrote, this is in a military magazine in the United States. After 2 weeks of coalition forces training that included the largest U.S. and Ukraine wet gap crossing, the first ever U.S. and Ukraine live fire exercise that had never happened before, and numerous other training demonstrations, the training efforts by the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault, that is an offensive, principally offensive U.S. military unit, were on full display as they trained the armed forces of Ukraine for months prior to the exercise. This is in September of 2019. So, and the last thing, and arguably the most important thing, is Trump's policies in his first administration with respect to nuclear arms control. Could you pull up image 8, Rami?
Yeah.
And what you're going to see here is a report, we've talked about it before on Reason to Resist, of Trump's reckless decision to withdraw the United States from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty known as the INF Treaty. This happened in, I believe, 2019, middle of 2019. You know, Scott Ritter, who played an important role in the implementation of that treaty, has talked many times about its profound importance to peace and the avoidance of nuclear war in Europe. These intermediate nuclear weapons missiles can reach their targets in a very short period of time. And by eliminating this class of weaponry, the United States under the administration of Ronald Reagan, the second term of Ronald Reagan, and the Soviet Union under the leadership of Gorbachev greatly reduced the risk of an inadvertent nuclear exchange. Because when you have very little time to react, you know that they've stationed these intermediate range weapons close to you, that they can reach your territory very quickly. You have very little time to react and make a decision whether or not that is an incoming nuclear missile or something else. This increases the possibility of human error with absolutely disastrous consequences quite considerably. And so this was a very important treaty. Trump pulled the United States out of that treaty. And recently, after the Russian Federation became fed up with the Ukrainians using Western-supplied ATACMS missiles to hit targets inside Russia, and you know, the government of the Russian Federation pointed out repeatedly, and I think correctly, that those missiles cannot be used without targeting data that is compiled and inputted by American military officials. The Ukrainians alone can't use them in their own discretion. And so the Russian Federation said, this effectively is the United States entering the war against us when they use these missiles to strike targets in Russia. And so the Russians eventually responded with a new intermediate range hypersonic missile called the Orezhnik, and used it to strike a target, a military production factory called Uzhmash, a giant Soviet-era military production factory in Ukraine. It's not entirely clear how damaging it was, because there's very little reliable photographic evidence out there about the aftermath, but very clearly there were multiple videos showing the missile coming in and striking, and there's really no dispute at this stage that it is hypersonic, and that this weapon it is intermediate range, and this weapon has multiple warheads, each of which have multiple sub-munitions that are independently maneuverable. So it is a devastating weapon, and if it's armed with nuclear warheads, I mean, you could probably wipe out half of the United Kingdom with just one of these missiles. And Putin went out of his way after this demonstration of force with this new missile to point out that this was developed after Trump dismantled the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and that this type of a weapon would have been impermissible under the INF Treaty, but Trump made it permissible. So that, in a nutshell, is what Donald Trump did in regard to Ukraine and Russia in his first term. He sent lethal weapons there repeatedly, something Obama had said that it's not something the American government should be doing because the Russians have escalation dominance there. He put in multiple sanctions on Russia, including the Nord Stream pipeline, contrary to the vigorous objections of the Europeans. He conducted military exercise in Ukraine, which included the first live fire exercises between the Ukrainian and Western militaries, and most importantly, withdrew the US from the INF Treaty. So what does the record of Donald Trump tell us about his attitude towards Russia? Not that he's soft on Russia, but that he has consistently, when he's had the power to do so, adopted a belligerent attitude towards Russia, and in some ways more belligerent than his predecessors. The fact that he's saying he wants to bring this war to an end, as I suggested earlier, I don't think that is more compelling evidence of how he's likely to behave than what he actually did when he had the power to pursue a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Ukraine during his first term in office. Now, I also want to say that Trump has said repeatedly that it's Joe Biden's fault that this war in Ukraine is happening now. There's no question that Biden bears a lot of responsibility, and maybe even the lion's share of the responsibility. So too does Obama. He bears some responsibility because of the overthrow of Yanukovych. But Trump also bears responsibility for this epic debacle that has resulted in the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. And at this stage, it's not even clear if there will be a state of Ukraine when all the dust is settled. And as I say, Trump bears some responsibility for that. Now, on the one other thing I want to point out, he's put together his Trump has his team, mostly assembled his desired incoming team for his second administration, and one of the characters that he's appointed to a significant position is a guy named Sebastian Gorka, who's deputy assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism, and his position is not apparently required to be approved by the Senate. So even though there have been harsh words from people like John Bolton about Gorka, the Senate isn't going to be able to block his appointment. Now, Gorka has been making some rather colorful remarks about Putin.
I think one tip away that the president has mentioned. He will say.
Sorry, that was these are the colorful remarks. Why don't you start all over again, Rami, so we can share them with people. This came from an interview, I believe, in November.
Yeah, I'll share my screen, Dimitri, with the Gorka's speech. For some reason, that browser is not working, so let's move it to this one here.
And this was an interview, I think, that Gorka gave I might be mistaken, but NBC News towards the end of November. Gorka, by the way, has quite a colorful history. He has associations with the far right, and has a record of just outright Islamophobia. The man has a hatred of Muslims. At one point, I think he suggested that 95% of the terrorists in the United States, like virtually all of them, are Muslims, when in fact the data compiled by the U.S. law enforcement authorities suggests that the greatest terrorist threat in the United States today comes from white supremacists. So he's a very, very controversial figure. Diplomacy is not his strong point, and here's an example.
Yeah, I'll
give one tip away that the president has mentioned. He will say to that murderous former KGB colonel, that thug who runs the Russian Federation, you will negotiate now, or the aid that we have given to Ukraine thus far will look like peanuts. That's how he will force those gentlemen to come to an arrangement that stops the bloodshed. I'll give one tip.
So, the murderous thug, whatever you may think about him, his forces have not, I'm talking about, of course, Gorka's reference to Vladimir Putin, his forces have not killed 16,000 or more Ukrainian children. His forces have not leveled to the ground a city of 2.3 million people. They have the capacity, the Russians, to do that to major urban centers like Kiev, like Kharkov, like Odessa, but they've done no such thing. And relative to the Israelis, at least, Russian forces in striking these cities have been quite precise and restrained. To suggest that, Vladimir Putin is a quote-unquote murderous thug, but Benjamin Netanyahu isn't, or Joe Biden isn't, that's really straining credulity, to put it mildly. But the main point here is this is not the tone nor the approach that is likely to result in any kind of peaceful resolution of the Ukraine war. Ultimately, Rami, and I'm interested in your thoughts upon this, I think what's going to happen is this. Let's bear in mind that NATO has been saying for 3 years, since this aspect of the war began in February 2022, that nothing less than Russia's complete withdrawal from what the West regards as the state of Ukraine. So this would include not only the 4 oblasts that Russia annexed in 2022, it would also include Crimea. Nothing less than the full withdrawal from that territory would suffice. And in addition, Ukraine must become a member of NATO. This has consistently been the position of NATO and the Ukrainian government. And the Russian president must be held accountable. They've demanded that as well, and they've demanded reparations from the Russian Federation. So if Donald Trump does a deal which meets the minimum demands of Russia, which are, we keep those 4 oblasts in their entirety, we keep Crimea as well, and Ukraine will never enter NATO, this would amount to an absolutely crushing and humiliating defeat for NATO. Just the minimum demands of the Russian Federation, and at this point, there's really no indication that Russia is willing to concede on any of those core demands. So I'm actually quite skeptical that Trump will agree to any of this. I think what is more likely going to happen, Rami, he will engage in negotiations. I do think he is genuinely concerned about nuclear war. And for that reason alone, I think he's going to want to try to bring this to an end. And in fact, there was this one moment in his debate with Kamala Harris. I personally consider it to be the most important moment in that debate, and it's one that the Western media just completely ignored, where he talked about the risk of a nuclear conflagration with Russia if the war was not brought to an end. He said it repeatedly during that debate. Kamala Harris had nothing to say in response. And, a lot of sensible people out there realize that he has every reason to be concerned about this. So I think he's going to make an effort, but I just don't think he'll be able to close the deal. And ultimately, it's going to be Russia, which is just going to run over the Ukrainian army and effectively impose a deal that the West simply will have no power to resist. And I think that may well happen next year. But the idea that Trump is going to concede on the core demands of NATO, I just don't see it. What do you think, Rami?
Well, I think the reason why we're even talking about this in the first place is because I think there's been some discussions around whether Trump is this anti-war person that is going to put an end to the situation in Ukraine, to the war in Ukraine. But the harsh reality is that, well, you spoke about Gorka, but also Marco Rubio leading the foreign policy under Trump. Trump is surrounded by neocons. Whether he is one or not, that's part of his strategy of getting what he wants. So first of all, the war in Ukraine is actually, to the way I see it, quite beneficial to the United States. We're seeing the rapid deindustrialization of Europe. Volkswagen is shutting its factories in Germany. The increasing cost of oil is forcing Europe to become a closer client, banana republic, if you want, for the United States, forcing them to buy their cars. United States have forced Europe to put 100% tariffs on Chinese imported electric vehicles. So the reality is that Trump probably doesn't see any issue keeping this war going on, as long as it means that sanctions are on Russia, being kept on Russia. And to another extent is that it's also beneficial, I believe, for both the United States and Russia to keep this war in Ukraine as a kind of a frozen conflict, because a state of a frozen conflict would force Ukraine to not be able to come to a settlement, which would allow it to enter NATO. That would also bring NATO to, as you said it, right? I mean, they would have strategically lost this war if it comes to an end. And this war still being on would also mean that there would be no reconciliation with Russia, keeping it as making it not possible for them to expand their markets into Europe. I spoke to a man called Arseny Kotov, a Russian war photographer, who's currently in, I don't know where, but in the special military operations zone, right? Wherever there's on the front lines of the war. And I asked him the question.
By the way, just so people know, we'll be publishing Rami's interview of this interesting Russian soldier. He's a very talented photographer, by the way. We'll be publishing that in the next few days. So keep an eye for that. Sorry, go ahead, Rami.
And when I asked him because I mean, I won't lie, I was, I had I was under this impression that Trump would be quick to end the war as he made it seem. And I asked him this question, and I was quite curious to know what would a Russian soldier think of Trump being brought into power. And his answer was very, very simple, very, very quick. Actually, the way he responded, it was, nothing's going to change. Trump wants to return the territory. Well, Trump wants to keep the war going on. Doesn't want to concede to what Russia wants. Russia wants to keep the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. There doesn't really seem that much appetite from Ukraine and the West to concede. So this war is going to keep going on.
Yeah. And also, neither of us mentioned that probably the biggest reason of all that this war is likely to continue is that it's good for the arms manufacturers in the United States, who have incredible amounts of power over the political class. I do think, though, Rami, I'm interested in your thoughts on this as well, that Trump probably will try to keep the war from escalating. He won't bring it to an end by, conceding to Russia's core demands, but he did in fact criticize quite harshly the authorization given to the Ukrainian military to use those ATACMS on Russian territory. So I hope and suspect that at least we can expect that much from Trump. Do you agree that he's going to try to avoid this getting out of hand?
I think we could very possibly see a similarity between what Ukraine is, what Georgia is today in the case of Ukraine. So we will keep seeing a government in power in Ukraine that is hostile to Russia, with a kind of a carrot stick approach in how to deal with the governments in Ukraine, right? So they want Ukraine to keep fighting, but they want the conflict to be frozen. I think Russia will not really break through where the front lines are. I mean, the line is pretty much, we've seen some recent developments in territories being captured by the Russians in recent weeks. But I don't think that Russia has the intentions of breaking those front lines and then crossing into Kiev, I think the state of the war right now is, in my opinion, or the way that I understand it, quite beneficial for both Russia and Ukraine. Both Russia and the United States. And we see Russia now getting closer to China. They've increased their amount of trade that is going on between these two countries. And Russia is basically conceding the European market to the United States. The United States have now are shipping over liquefied natural gas by boat to Europe, which is expensive enough to make the Americans happy and expensive enough to not let Europe industrialize itself.
Yeah, I just saw a report today that Ukraine has just agreed to buy large quantities of liquefied natural gas from the United States.
And I mean, also, well, Trump is a huge fan of using sanctions as a weapon for negotiations, a negotiation tactic. He's coming into power with already a lot of sanctions put on Russia. I mean, when did we ever see Trump remove sanctions on countries, especially without directly benefiting the United States? So I don't see why would Trump ever remove sanctions on Russia. These sanctions are there to protect America's markets, are there to protect America as a hegemony. And I know we're going to talk about this later on, but there's a reason why I believe Trump wants to get access to Greenland and Canada. It's because the Arctic Circle, that Russia is pretty much the country that has the highest claims to the Arctic Circle. And
probably the best capacity at this stage, just from the perspective of its technologies to actually exploit resources in the Arctic Circle. You know, you look at its nuclear-powered icebreakers and so forth, and its drilling technologies. So yeah, I'm sure that's a good point, Rami. Absolutely, I think that's probably a motivating factor here as well. But why don't we move on to, because we're running out of time, why don't we move on to our next subject, which is West Asia?
Absolutely. Yeah, so, well, I mean, Dimitri, we've seen the current collapse of the government of Syria. There's been an increase in sectarian violence between the different ethnic groups, or not ethnic groups, but the different subgroups in Syria. And there's been pockets of resistance of, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily even call it loyalist forces to Bashar al-Assad, because in reality, it really has nothing to do with Bashar, and more has to do with fighting some form of Sunni supremacy in Syria by Sunnis that are financed and backed by the Turks, the Turkish government. And we've been also seeing a lot of back and forths between, the targeting of American warships in the Red Sea by Ansarullah, as well as Israel hitting the Yemeni airport in Sana'a. So, I mean, I don't even know where to start in talking about what will Trump have and how will Trump behave in the Middle East and West Asia, considering there's just so many different fronts. But go for it, Dimitri.
Yeah. So why don't we start with his record, as we did in the case of Ukraine and Russia, and I would sum it all up. As Trump in his first 4 years in office was basically a bull in a china shop in West Asia. And here are some of the highlights. You know, as I said, and I'll say it again until I'm blue in the face, you are what your record says you are, man. And in his first term, Trump gave Israel everything it wanted. So first, he moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This move was so controversial that even to this very day, few Western states have followed Trump's lead and moved their embassies to Jerusalem. Canada, for example, continues to have its embassy in Tel Aviv, even though our government is very closely allied with Netanyahu's genocidal regime. Second, Trump recognized Israel's annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. Again, they were occupied for the first time in 1967. Israel purported to annex them in the 1980s. They have never ceded an inch of that ground. This is of strategic importance to Syria. Again, this was so controversial that very few Western states followed Trump's lead and recognized the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. To this very day, Canada maintains, again, a close ally of Israel, that territory does not belong to Israel, and that the settlements Israel has built there are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Third, Trump ordered the assassination of Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani. He killed him outside the airport in Baghdad. So by doing that, he not only committed an act of war against Iran and almost provoked a full-scale war with Iran, but he also violated in a very severe way the sovereignty of Iraq and killed a number of important figures from the popular militias in Iraq who really were representatives of the Iraqi government in that same drone strike in 2019. Now, could you pull up image 11, Rami, just so no one has any questions about whether Israel supported that particular crime? It won't surprise you to know that it did. And it may well be that behind the scenes, Netanyahu was urging Trump to kill Soleimani. And here he is praising Trump profusely shortly after the killing of Soleimani in Iraq, even though at that moment there were very serious concerns about whether this would cause a major war in West Asia. So what other goodies did Santa Trump give to his little elf over there in Israel? Well, he killed the Iran nuclear deal. And this was the Obama-era nuclear deal, which would have prevented Iran from being in a position to develop a nuclear weapon if Iran complied with the deal. And the International Atomic Energy Association confirmed repeatedly that Iran was complying with the deal. And here you can see, this is a report from Responsible Statecraft in May of this year. The result of this decision was that Iran is now closer to having a nuclear weapon than it was at any time, either before the signing of the Obama-era nuclear deal or during the time that that deal was in effect. So here you have another example of how Trump's foreign policies during his first term actually made the American people less secure, not more secure, but less secure. So even if the only thing that matters to you is the security of the American people, and you don't care about the human rights of other people, you don't care about international law, you don't care about peace in foreign countries, you just care about the security of the American people, just by that criterion alone, I would suggest to you that Trump's foreign policy during his first term in office was a disaster. Now, can you go to the next image, Rami? Just so you can, I just want to remind people about how we ended up getting to the Trump administration's destruction of the Obama-era nuclear deal. You may recall, I think it's a prior version, but we don't have to go there. The point I wanted to make was, as many of you will recall, Netanyahu went to Congress, the United States Congress, I think it was towards the end of Obama's second term, and basically humiliated Obama, castigated him inside the United States Congress while receiving dozens of standing ovations, which is par for the course when Netanyahu goes to speak to the Congress critters, and just basically tore shreds off the Obama administration. So there's no question that there was a lot of pressure behind the scenes, and it wasn't even behind the scenes, on Trump to bring an end to that deal. And he gave Netanyahu exactly what he wanted, with potentially disastrous implications for the security of the American people if Iran develops a nuke. And you just saw up on the screen there, Rami showed an image from a newspaper about the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on Iran after withdrawing from the nuclear deal that Iran was respecting. This had very negative impacts on innocent Iranians who are supposedly the people whom the US government and other Western governments are trying to protect through their sanctions policies. But in any event, the impact of this was to cause Iran to become closer and closer to both Russia and China, which is probably exactly the last thing that serves the interests of the security of the American people. So could you enter or pull up image 15, Rami?
Yeah.
and this is a report on a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement that Iran and China entered into in early 2021. So this would have been a couple of years after Trump took a wrecking ball to the JCPOA, as it was called, the Obama-era nuclear deal. And they've been getting closer and closer ever since. China is now Iran's largest trading partner, and Iran provides 15% of China's imported oil. Now, I want to highlight something that happened today that is potentially quite significant. If you could pull up image 16, Rami. The foreign minister of China and the foreign minister of Iran held a meeting yesterday in Beijing. And I'm sure that the subject of, Trump's policies and his, potential for escalating the war against Israel's war on Iran, considerably was a subject of some discussion and importance in the meeting between these two foreign ministers. Now, in the course of commenting, this was a statement put out today by the State Council of the People's Republic of China, and you'll see that they talked about their comprehensive cooperation plan and advancing its implementation. And further down in the article, there was a very interesting paragraph. So this would be the following image, Rami. I took a screenshot of our article. It's image 17, where the Chinese foreign minister was asked to comment on China's attitude towards, the Islamic Republic's supposed ambitions to have a nuclear weapon. And this is what they said. On the Iranian nuclear issue, Wang, that's the foreign minister of the People's Republic of China, stressed that China always stands for a political and diplomatic resolution and upholds the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that's the Obama-era nuclear deal, opposes sanctions and pressure at every turn, and firmly supports Iran in safeguarding its legitimate rights and interests. He also called on all relevant parties to play a constructive role in resuming dialogue and negotiation. Those words, firmly supports Iran in safeguarding its legitimate rights and interests, when taken together with the fact that Wang said nothing about the prospect of Iran developing a nuclear weapon. He didn't even say, that China doesn't want to see Iran go down the nuclear path. He didn't even say that much. He certainly didn't warn that there would be any kind of consequences. He just said nothing about the possibility that Iran is developing or may soon develop a nuclear weapon. And on the contrary, stressed how much China supports Iran in safeguarding its legitimate rights and interests. So I think what the Chinese government may be signaling to the West is that it's not going to stand in the way and it's not going to penalize Iran under the circumstances we're now in if it decides to develop a nuclear weapon. And that may be something that Iran is currently in the process of doing. One thing is very clear, everybody's in agreement that they're very close to having a nuclear weapon if they decide to go down that path. So yet again, we see how the policies of the Trump administration in the first time he was in office have undermined the security of the American people. What other goodies did Trump give to Israel? Well, he gave them the Abraham Accords, which resulted in normalization between certain Arab states without any Palestinian state. And in fact, when the Abraham Accords were entered into, Israel was all but declaring the peace process dead and had made quite clear that it had no interest in giving the Palestinian people a state. And yet, Trump stimulated a normalization between Arab governments and Israel. And I think it's quite fair to assume that this, and I think based on the public statements of Hamas's leadership, this was a significant motivating factor in their decision to launch the October 7th attacks. They had reached a point of hopelessness. They saw certain important Arab governments were giving up on them, prepared to normalize with Israel, even though there was no prospect of a Palestinian state with the current crowd of political leaders in Israel. And so he may well have contributed, Trump, through the Abraham Accords and completely flushing down the toilet Palestinian aspirations for a sovereign state. he may well have contributed to the decision by Hamas to launch the October 7th attacks, which itself has provoked, so much suffering because of Israel's genocidal response. And, in terms of what Trump has done since then, he's now surrounded himself with pro-Israel fanatics like Mike Huckabee, the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, and Marco Rubio, whom you mentioned, Rami. Huckabee is an evangelical Christian, or claims to be a Christian. Whether he is another matter altogether. He says he's visited Israel more than 100 times. He opposes the two-state solution. He supports Israel's West Bank settlements, which are not only an insurmountable obstacle to a two-state solution, but are also a violation of international law. And in an interview in 2017, Huckabee said, quote, "There is no such thing as a West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria," which is the biblical name that Israel's government uses to describe the West Bank. And he went on, Huckabee, and said, "There's no such thing as a settlement. They're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're cities. There's no such thing as an occupation." So this is the new ambassador under Trump to Israel. Huckabee has gone so far as to question whether Palestinians are even a people. Rubio, this lunatic, has openly said repeatedly he opposes a ceasefire in Gaza. He also views Iran as the ultimate evil in the region. Now, what does this all mean? Israel unquestionably wants the United States to attack Iran. What reason do we have to believe that the Santa Trump, who has always given, the gifts to Netanyahu that he was clamoring for, is suddenly going to draw a line in the sand and say, "We're not giving that to you." Even though we receive so much money, our campaign, from pro-Israel billionaires, even though I've constantly touted my commitment to support Israel in every aspect of its agenda, we're not going to give you the thing that matters to you most, which is all-out war against Iran. Again, I'm skeptical, based on the record, that Trump is going to show restraint here. He certainly hasn't shown it in the past. Hard to believe he's going to do that in the future. Having said that, again, this doesn't mean that the resistance is going to be defeated. If, in fact, it turns out that Trump is going to give Netanyahu the war that he so, ardently desires with Iran, there's going to be a hell of a price to pay, not just for the United States and Israel, but for all of the West, because Iran has the capacity to stop the flow of oil out of West Asia. That will be extremely damaging to just the risk of a cutoff. The oil would cause the price of oil to soar. And that'll be extremely damaging to the global economy. Europe, I think in particular, is going to be very badly hit by that. And Russia and Iran has hypersonic missiles, which they have demonstrated Israel cannot shoot down, nor can the Americans. And they have many of them. And as Rami mentioned, Iran is very likely supplying those missiles to Yemen, which the Americans and the Israelis are incapable of destroying. And some of them have penetrated Israel's air defenses, and as have Yemeni drones. And these are not the most sophisticated weapons in the arsenal of the axis of resistance. So there will be a heavy military price to pay if Trump goes down this path as well. And of course, whatever the outcome of that war may be, whether the resistance prevails or it doesn't, one thing is for sure: it's going to cause immense suffering, first and foremost to the peoples of West Asia, including Israelis, but also to the rest of the world, because of the impact it's going to have on trade and the price of oil. What are your thoughts about all of this, Rami? Am I being too pessimistic here about Trump's likely intentions with respect to Israel and Iran, or do you think?
I think that we should maybe emphasize a bit more of what does Syria mean today for Trump's vision of the Middle East and what can happen. Well, you've mentioned that there could possibly be an American, Israeli motivated American attack on Iran. Well, we know that Syria is not looking to join any war against Israel, and if anything, it's I mean, the most recent news of how Syria is being governed, it really seems like it's being led by people in the United States and Israel. So we know the Syrian airspace could easily be used to target Israel, to target Iran, sorry. But I'm more intrigued into knowing what kind of agreement does Iran have with Russia. We know that Russia was able to purchase a lot of drones from Iran that were then used in Ukraine. So could there be some form of pact between Russia and Iran, and similarly a pact between Iran and China that would come to their defense in case there was an attack by the United States? We note that Iran is crucial to both Russia and China. It's centrally located in some way in the middle, sandwiched between Russia and China. So from a geographical standpoint, this would be a complete disaster for Russia and China. So I personally don't see this happening in the next 4 years, simply because America doesn't necessarily need to. It could focus all of its effort into making sure that we have a second Sykes-Picot, right? So we had a first Sykes-Picot that divided the Middle East and in some way just took Palestine away from the Palestinians and gave it over to a couple of Europeans. But we could maybe see pushing of more sectarian division in Syria, dividing Syria and putting all our resources into this. We had the first Abraham Accord between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, who am I forgetting?
And Morocco.
And Morocco, sorry. And there was some sort of agreement with Sudan as well during the Abraham Accords. Now we could see an extension of the Abraham Accords. And the first country that comes to my mind into what this new Abraham Accord would look like could possibly be Syria. We had Kevork Almasyan speak to you, Dimitri, on Reason to Resist, where he mentioned that he gave 5 years for Syria to normalize with Israel. Maybe we're not going to see it in the first year. We note that the Abraham Accords came quite late in Trump's mandate. So it's kind of, he creates some sort of momentum to leave with a bang. So I wouldn't be shocked if we see a normalization agreement between Syria, and that would legitimize the Syrian government in the West. They just removed last week, what's his name again? Ahmed al-Shara, Jolani's list on the terrorist list, simply because, well, he showed openness to wanting to negotiate with Israel, to come to peace with Israel. What are the final requirements? Trump knows how to use leverage. Trump knows what Syria needs. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't really care about the Syrian people, nor about the fate of the Syrian leaders once they do what the Americans tell them to do. So I personally find that America will most likely push a normalization agreement between Syria and Israel. And more importantly, the Middle East requires Israel needs to be lucky every day to sustain its existence. With the collapse of, before the collapse of Bashar al-Assad, Israel could probably have guaranteed its existence for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But for the next 100 years or 200 years, Israel needs to anticipate that the countries surrounding it could one day become stronger economically, militarily, and in my it's for me it's unthinkable that Israel could sustain itself in the current way the Middle East is formed and standing. So it needs to divide it needs to push bigger division in the Middle East and to collapse Syria into balkanized Batustans, if you want to call it that way, and then what will arise from these Batustans would most likely be the equivalent of an Arab NATO, or not even an Arab NATO, because then we would be back to our tribal identifications of a Alawite state, a Druze state, a Phalangist state in Lebanon. God knows what it would be, but that's where I would see Trump focusing all of his efforts, dividing the Middle East into deeper sectarian divide, and then governing the Middle East through a Middle Eastern NATO that will ensure that there's military cooperation between all of these states, and that would guarantee Israel's security for the next 200 years. because Syria right now is in the hands of Jolani, someone who's loyal to Israel and the United States. But I mean, if we keep seeing bigger bigger influence from the global South, we could probably end up seeing Syria coming back to the hands of pan-Arabs or of anti-Zionists, and that is a gamble that Israel cannot take, and it needs to strike while the iron is still hot. So I anticipate bigger divide in the Middle East and an Arab NATO. I personally do not think we will see a Saudi normalization with Israel, at least not in the sense of state recognition. This is not me believing MBS's honest words that he wants to see a Palestinian state. He doesn't, but he needs to keep this facade, because don't forget that Saudi Arabia needs to keep its influence in the region and of the masses of the people, right? So when Ramadan starts, everyone looks at when is Saudi Arabia celebrating Eid? When is Saudi Arabia dictating a bit place a huge influence in the Middle East? I don't think the everyday Arabs, everyday Sunnis are ready to accept, are ready to have the appetite for Saudi normalization with Israel, and that would cost their own reputation. So what I see would be probably more of cooperation, which would be a kind of de facto recognition of Israel, but that feeds the appetite of what the Sunni people in the Middle East can agree on. That could be joint collaboration projects. We know that Saudi Arabia is building the Neon project that is, for some reason, super close to Israel, right? They could have built it anywhere in Saudi Arabia. There's desert everywhere where this project could be built. They purposefully put Neon because, that place close to Israel, because it will force it to have some level of cooperation that previously never made it possible to have. And at the end of the day, my last thought is that Trump gives us the reality of what the Middle East is, that the establishment in Washington is too shy to tell us how it is. Jerusalem was always the de facto capital of Israel in the eyes of the Americans, just without the embassy. Trump is able to recognize when is the time to take decisions, when is the time to take actions, and to remove this charade and this facade. So Arab normalization with Israel came to shock to everyone except the Palestinians, and so it was no surprise at all. And that is because, well, we know it, but it was not palatable enough at that moment to show it to the world. So again, Trump will probably take some big actions in West Asia. Balkanizing Syria might be one that is going to a tough pill to swallow. But at the end of the day, nothing is new. Nothing is new.
Right. Well, before we move on to China, I just want to say one thing in response. So that's entirely plausible. I think your prediction for how Trump is going to deal with this. But again, he's going to have to disappoint Israel if he goes down that path, because Israel is not going to be comfortable leaving Iran under the power of the current government, particularly when it has the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon, which it clearly does. I think there's universal agreement about that. And it has hypersonic ballistic missiles, conventional ballistic missiles that Israel can't shoot down. So for the Trump administration to go down that path, and it might well do that, I think it's a plausible scenario, it would have to say to Israel, we're leaving that government in place with those weapons and that capacity to develop a nuclear arsenal. I don't know if Trump is going to be able to resist the demands of the Zionist lobby, that threat be brought to an end. And the only other thing I'll add, Rami, is that Syria normalizing with Israel would require there to be a functioning central government in Israel in Syria, I should say, that has some kind of legitimacy. This government has absolutely no legitimacy. It has no real control over large swaths of Syrian territory. The indications are that the country, sadly, is going to descend into chaos, probably a good bit of sectarian violence. And there's this war in the north between the Kurds and the Turks that has to be resolved. So I question whether Syria is going to be in any shape to normalize with anybody anytime soon. But in any event, we'll see. So let's move on to China in the time remaining to us. I'll quickly go over Trump's record there. Again, we'll do the same exercise as we've done with respect to West Asia and Ukraine. Most of the sanctions that are currently on China began under the Trump administration. In 2018, the administration banned U.S. agencies from using any systems, equipment, and services from Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant. In July 2020, Chinese officials were sanctioned by the U.S. under its Uyghur human rights policy of 2020 for what the U.S. called, quote, gross violations of human rights, close quote, in the western region of Xinjiang. And the U.S. barred entrance into the U.S. for named officials, certain named Chinese officials and their immediate families. A month later, the Trump administration imposed sanctions on then Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam and 10 other Hong Kong officials for, quote, undermining Hong Kong's autonomy and restricting the freedom of expression or assembly of the citizens of Hong Kong. In November 2020, so this was a couple of months before Trump's first term came to an end, Trump signed an executive order prohibiting all U.S. institutional retail investors from investing or purchasing from Chinese companies that the U.S. Department of Defense had identified as, quote, communist Chinese military companies. And during his first administration, the Trump administration authorized 20 arms deals with Taiwan, having a total dollar value of about US $18 billion. It's a very small place, Taiwan, and that's a lot of military weaponry for such a small place, in my opinion. And then something that kind of got lost in the midst of time, but I think it's now going to potentially rear its ugly head, is that in January 2021, just before Joe Biden took office, it was just, I think, the day before Joe Biden took office, maybe 2 days before Joe Biden took office, Trump did something very provocative. Could you please pull up image 18, Rami? So as I believe this was CNN described at the time, it was a parting shot. The Trump administration came out and formally accused China of committing genocide against the Uyghurs, which is quite, rich considering Trump's support of a state that is openly committing genocide in Palestine today. But in any event, it emerged a month later that the Trump administration, if you could pull up the following image, Rami, I believe this is 19. The Trump administration had been receiving advice from the State Department lawyers, which was radically inconsistent with the decision to accuse China of genocide. What they were telling Trump privately, as the US press reported at the time, is that there was insufficient evidence to prove genocide against China. And nonetheless, Trump accused China of genocide the day before he left office. The Biden administration, I think, doubled down on this. They didn't stress it too much in their public commentary about China. But to my knowledge, they've never retracted the U.S. government's allegation that China is committing genocide. I have seen no indication whatsoever that Trump is going to withdraw that allegation. It's kind of, striking that Trump has confirmed, his officials have confirmed that they invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration. So he invited to his inauguration somebody who, according to him, Donald Trump, is presiding over a genocide in China. So chew on that for a while. In any event, again, the record of China of the Trump administration with respect to China has been one of extraordinary belligerence. Last month, Trump threatened to impose an additional 10% tariff above any additional tariffs on imports from China. It's not entirely clear what that meant, but it sounds like a potential escalation of a trade war that's been brewing between China and the United States for some time. So what is Trump going to do with respect to China? Well, I suspect that what is going on in Ukraine and West Asia is going to be a considerable distraction for the U.S. government in the near term, in the first year or so of the Trump administration. But I think it's very clear that key people, he's surrounded himself with China hawks, and he himself has understood for some time that the greatest challenge to U.S. global hegemony is China. And from in every possible respect, when it comes to military advancements and technologies, when it comes to industrial production, when it comes to civilian technologies. I mentioned the case of Huawei. China, which now has, on a purchasing power parity basis, the largest economy in the world, with a significantly larger economy than that of the United States. It is the major obstacle to U.S. global hegemony. So how exactly Trump is going to deal with China, it's a very interesting question. I don't think it's going to be a policy of détente. I'm not prepared to go out any further on a limb than that. I think it is going to be a policy that is designed to weaken China, isolate China, cause economic damage to China. But whether Trump would be willing to take it up a notch and risk open military confrontation, that I don't know. He may not be willing to go that far. Before we turn to the Western Hemisphere, to close it out, Rami, what are your thoughts about Trump's likely attitude towards China?
Well, first of all, I don't think China and even Russia is a threat to any working class people in North America or in the West. But I do recognize that China would definitely be a threat to the oligarch class in the United States, simply because China is way more competitive than Americans are at producing products. Even Canada introduced a 100% tariff on imported electric vehicles from China. There was this BYD, which is the largest electric vehicle manufacturing company in the world, although we don't even have them in North America, or there's very little of them in Canada anyways. They built an electric car that is around $13,000. Even with a 100% tariff, it is still the cheapest electric vehicle that we could ever buy in Canada if it was available on the market. Mm-hmm. We need to also note, we're going to talk about the Monroe Doctrine later on in the Western Hemisphere, but similarly, America and the West in general has a policy of suffocating China, and that came from the compromise of the West wanting to do business with a communist country, with communist China, during the Sino-Soviet tensions or war. And that compromise was that Americans will have the ability to do business in China as long as China is under some form of relative control. And that meant two things. The island chain link that we see in the Pacific Ocean that goes from South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, and of course Taiwan, that kind of suffocates China's ability to export their products through the Pacific Ocean to the United States or to the international waters. All of their boats need to pass by waters controlled by the West. And that meant that they could filter out what can and can't leave China. And that's why we're seeing that the biggest tensions between China are not in central China, but it's going to be in the Xinjiang province that it makes it possible for China to export its product to Western China, to Central Asia and to Europe by land, or through the island chain link by boat. China realistically wants to break the island chain link and wants to reduce its volatility in Xinjiang in order to be able to export its product. So naturally, it's trying to fix whatever tensions that the Americans are creating in Xinjiang, and similarly, it will want to break off of its islands in Taiwan. So naturally, I think we're seeing more and more drills by China to possibly reunite with Taiwan, right? The one China policy. And Trump is already hedging his bets, or the United States are hedging their bets in Taiwan by moving manufacturing of semiconductor chips into the United States. We know that Intel is in some way getting favorable treatment by the United States in order to push chip manufacturing there. So that's in a sense where I could see these things from happening. I have a couple of friends that are in the import business and export business in China. I'll be in China around the time of the Canton Fair. It looks like factories there are quite sensitive to the reality of the possibility of a trade war with China. We've seen that first trade war under Trump's mandate. So that's the way that I see it. But in reality, China is a much more developed economy, and their military is scaling quite rapidly. And I don't think the United States will be able to keep up. China will keep its position of being quite not necessarily pacifist, but a harmonious or a peaceful approach to dealing with the Americans and dealing with the West. But again, it's going to be hard to predict what's going to happen in the case of Taiwan and Xinjiang.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And an interesting thing, I really don't know what will happen in this regard. How we did talk about this with Ben Norton 10 days ago. Ben Norton, by the way, very knowledgeable geopolitical commentator who's based in Beijing and is pursuing doctoral studies there. And I asked him about whether China's non-interference policy was going to continue if the U.S. launches an all-out war on Iran, with whom it has this comprehensive strategic partnership. And he believed, I thought his arguments were persuasive, that China's very unlikely to become involved directly in a military sense, although they may well provide weaponry and other military technologies to Iran, and may already have done so. And also from a political and economic perspective, will do everything they can to support Iran. But Russia, I think, is likely to be more assertive, maybe not to the point of introducing its own combat troops into the theater of conflict in West Asia involving Iran. But would Russia send personnel to operate, Russian-made air defense systems in Iran or Russian-made electronic warfare equipment in Iran? I think that's entirely possible, and they may already have done that, the Russians. So this is going to be a very interesting challenge for both the Chinese and the Russians to confront if a full-blown war breaks out between Iran and the United States. So with that, let's turn to our last area of the world, the Western Hemisphere. We'll have to be a little bit quick on this one, Rami, because I've taken up too much time in my discussion of Trump's record, I think. So we've made a couple of references to the Monroe Doctrine. For those who haven't heard it before, it's not particularly complicated, the Monroe Doctrine. It dates back from a president who ruled the United States many years ago. And the essential policy of the Monroe Doctrine is that the United States must have unchallenged hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. No significant competitor, and certainly today that would include Russia and China, can interfere in the Western Hemisphere or in North America or South America. That's the principle. And Trump has oftentimes talked as though he's a big fan of the Monroe Doctrine. And I've heard some, knowledgeable geopolitical commentators in the alternative media saying recently that that may well be what Trump's focus is going to be in his second term in terms of his foreign policy, is re-implementing, as if, it's not fully in effect, arguably it already is, the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. So just a couple of specific comments. Right out of the gate, after Trump won the election, he threatened Canada and Mexico with a 25% tariff on imports if they didn't clamp down on drugs, particularly fentanyl, and migrants who were crossing the border from those countries into the United States. It's quite clear that any such tariff would violate the free trade deal between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. I doubt that Trump is particularly concerned about that. Promptly upon this threat being issued, Justin Trudeau, whose tenure as Canada's prime minister is very likely to come to an end in the next few months, he rushed to Mar-a-Lago to placate Donald Trump. And a few weeks later, Trudeau announced a new program for border control. Could you please pull up image 20, Rami? And I wanted to share this with you just so you'll see how Trudeau is referring to this new border control program. It's going to cost, he estimates, 1.3 billion, and he's calling it the Joint Strike Force. And it entails 24/7 surveillance of the Canada-U.S. border. Now, the Canada-U.S. border is huge. I believe it's the longest undefended border in the world. Parts of it are very large, swaths of it are very sparsely populated, particularly between British Columbia, the westernmost province of Canada, and Ontario in central Canada, which is the most populous province. So, the borders of the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba with the United States are fairly sparsely populated. How you are going to get 24/7 surveillance of that entire border, and how you might accomplish that with an expenditure of $1.3 billion, I don't know. Sounds difficult to accomplish to me, but what I'm most concerned about is the terminology that the Canadian government is employing. This new strike force. It's exactly the kind of thing that would appeal to Donald Trump, a militarized border. And so, beyond Canada, I think Canada under the Trump administration, whatever problems Canada encounters are going to pale in comparison to those of governments that don't do the bidding of Washington. At the end of the day, Canada's government almost always does the bidding of Washington. And so it's not likely to be on the receiving end of the harsher treatments that the Monroe Doctrine will entail. The countries that I think are in real trouble, I'm sorry to say, are Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, because their governments have shown, who've steadfastly refused to abide by the dictates of Washington and have adopted economic models that don't suit the interests of American crony capitalism. And with Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State of the United States in the next Trump administration, a man who has a seething hatred for the governments of those four countries, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Cuba, and Venezuela. I can only imagine, Rami, that the sanctions are going to get even more severe. Cuba hardly has a stable power system anymore. The people are really struggling in Cuba. It's almost approaching the level of a failed state because of the collapse of the energy system. The Trump administration, there was another UN General Assembly resolution on the U.S. embargo on Cuba. The only states that supported the embargo in the United Nations General Assembly in this most recent resolution, I think it was the last couple of months, were the United States and Israel. That's it. The rest of the world was opposed. I think there were a few states that abstained, but overwhelming opposition to this inhumane embargo. And it's, one of the few good things that Obama did in terms of foreign policy was he began to ease the punishing sanctions on Cuba, which have always been a form of collective punishment. It's the Cuban people, innocent Cubans, who've suffered the most because of them. And sadly, I think they're likely to get even more severe. And this is, whatever they may do militarily in regard to China, I think the Trump administration is going to be a lot more tempted to engage in some kind of military action, covert or otherwise, with respect to those four governments. And in fact, in 2018, Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, accused the Trump administration of trying to assassinate him. I think he accused it more than once. And there was actually an attempt on Maduro's life, it seems. So I guess the only other thing I'll add is there's this, far-right character, Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, who's still lurking out there. And he's been making noises that the incoming Trump administration is somehow going to heighten his prospects of making a grand return to Brazilian politics and perhaps unseat Lula da Silva from the presidency. Bolsonaro is accused by the courts of Brazil of having tried to execute a coup after he lost the election against Lula. And as far as I know, for most of the time since then, he's been hiding out in Florida, probably not far from Trump's palatial Mar-a-Lago villa. But what's your take on all of this? Before we go over to the Q&A, Rami, What do you think the highlights are going to be of Trump's foreign policy towards the Western Hemisphere?
He mentioned Canada being a 51st state. I mean, I don't think that's ever going to be realistic, of course, but the reality is that there are ways for America to get what it wants from Canada, whether it is, we note that America has been quite critical of Canada's military spending. Trump often called for Canada to pay up, and that NATO countries shouldn't depend on America to back them at all times, and that they need to increase their military spending. That means buying more American weapons. We know that America wants to have bigger claims to the Arctic Circle. Canada, in some way, pretty much has much more claims to the Arctic Circle than America does. You spoke about the Monroe Doctrine, and what particularly interests me about this is that the whole Monroe Doctrine revolves around the fact that no European powers could have a presence in the Western Hemisphere. And that is America basically acknowledging that the possible threat of having powers or foreign is a big word here, but European powers in the Western Hemisphere. And America's defense comes from the fact that, I mean, usually a lot of American spokespeople refer to the best defense as their two oceans, surrounded by two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. But its other threats could also be military expansion of other powers through, Canada in that case, which I don't think is a possibility, or Latin America. So we noticed that Peru opened a port with Chinese financing and funding, basically a Chinese port in Peru. And there was a Newsweek article that came out that called it, I'll just pull it up over here, which basically calls Peru America's backyard. And that's pretty much the dynamics that we're noticing in Latin America, America vis-a-vis other countries in the Western Hemisphere. So that's in general what kind of, and also just in a different sense, in the case of Canada, well, we also during Trump's mandate imprisoned the daughter of Huawei's executive or founder for like 1,000 days, and that came under the pressure of the Americans. So what Trump is basically saying right now, when kind of calling for Canada to be its 51st state, I think it's quite obvious that it's a negotiating tactic to get full compliance and subservience from Canada, a level of subservience that, I mean, I cannot see how much more it could be, considering we are quite submissive to the United States. Mm-hmm. We know they're going to renegotiate a trade agreement between NAFTA states, right? So Canada, United States, and Mexico. Mm-hmm. But I mean, also the way I see America's strategy in the Western Hemisphere also shows that it's anticipating bigger tensions with BRICS, or maybe not BRICS, but definitely Russia and China specifically. Mm-hmm. So it's hedging its bet and protecting, and I mean, protecting is a big word here, but preparing itself for what possible tensions we will see in the upcoming years.
Yeah, a couple other thoughts I'll add, Rami, before we go to the Q&A. Trump, as we all know, has been ranting and raving about illegal immigrants in the United States. I suspect strongly that he's going to pursue policies in the Western Hemisphere, particularly with respect to those four countries that I mentioned, that are going to exacerbate the flow of migrants, desperate migrants from Central and South America into the United States. There is no fail-safe way to stop them from coming. If they're desperate enough, they will make the journey. If they feel that there's even just a small prospect of them having a much better life in the country where they're situated, they're doomed to a life of penury. Then many of them will venture. They'll make the attempt to come to the United States. So if Trump were actually serious about bringing an end to, or even just easing the flow of migrants from Central and South America into the United States, he would pursue policies that are going to improve the economic circumstances of the people of the countries from which these people are coming primarily. In fact, he's likely going to do the exact opposite. He's going to make the economic circumstances more desperate, which will create an even more serious problem in terms of the flow of economic migrants. So at the end of the day, Rami, it ain't looking good for stability in Central and South America. But hopefully, efforts of the Chinese to develop relations on a cooperative economic basis with various countries in Central and South America will create a counterweight to U.S. hegemonic efforts in the region and force the United States to pursue policies that are more balanced in terms of the interests of of other countries in the region. In any event, we are now at the hour and 35-minute mark, so I think we should probably turn to our Q&A at this point, unless you have something else you wanted to add before we do that.
I think we're good for Q&A. Folks, feel free to post some questions in the chat. I already have a couple of questions lined up that I can look at. But yes, keep them coming. The first question that we have is from Daniel Drazinovich, who says, who would Dimitri vote for in a Canadian election?
I'm assuming you're referring to the current crop of leaders, the people who are likely to be leaders when the next election happens. I can say with absolute certainty that I will not vote Liberal or Conservative under any circumstances, unless the Liberals pull a rabbit out of the hat and appoint as their leader to replace Justin Trudeau somebody who is truly committed to human rights, peace, and social justice, which I just can't see happening. It's inconceivable that I would vote Liberal, and under no circumstances am I going to vote for Pierre Poilievre. The other options, at least if we're talking about people who are in Canada's Parliament, are unappealing, to be perfectly blunt about it. The parties themselves include a lot of talented people. I'm talking here particularly about the Green Party and the NDP at the level of the base, and they do have some very talented and appealing candidates. But at the leadership level, I can't really in good conscience support either party, frankly. So at this stage, I'm probably going to vote for a party that doesn't have a presence in Parliament. It would probably very much be of a left-wing persuasion, or I'm going to spoil my ballot in an act of protest. That's where my head is currently at. What about you, Rami? Do you have any idea what you're going to do when the time comes to vote?
Hopefully I will not be in Canada when there's the upcoming elections, and I pretty much have no faith in the Canadian political parties that we have in front of us. If there's a miracle new party created, I'd be more than happy to hear what they have to offer, but the Greens have shown themselves to not be quite allies of the Palestinian people. They've shaped themselves to be some form of green capitalists that are pretty much the same as the German Greens that we see. The Liberals are frauds. The Conservatives are, they have blood on their hands. They're openly supporting the genocide in Palestine. A lot of people are bandwagging around them because of I have trouble understanding why as well. But I will most likely not vote in the Canadian elections. I have a lot more hope in the change that is going to happen from outside. I'm a lot more enthusiastic in seeing the developments that we're seeing in China and in BRICS countries, Russia, and of course in Palestine and Yemen. So that's pretty much what I've lost faith in Canadian elections and Canadian political parties quite a long time ago.
I just want to say something of general application for those who are really frustrated, and there are many of us out there with our options, whether you're Canadian, American, European, nowadays it doesn't matter. The electoral landscape is pretty grim when we look at the parties that are best positioned to actually assume power. I've been thinking a lot about, how we might change all of this. And although I don't have any magic wand to wave, it seems to me that the fundamental problem we have is that we keep legitimizing the outcome by voting. And if, the eventual winner can say credibly that a large proportion of the population voted, they get over a turnout of over, let's say, 50%, or even better, 60 or 70%. They can claim that they have a democratic mandate, even though the process wasn't really democratic, because every other candidate, all the candidates that came from a party other than the two that have dominated politics in the West for the post-World War II period, really had no shot. The system is constructed in such a way as to empower election after election one of two parties. This is true in Canada, it's true in the United States, it's true in every major European country. And anybody who doesn't represent either of those two major so-called mainstream parties is effectively blocked by a variety of tactics from getting to power. So how do you deal with this situation? One option is to delegitimize it by not voting, by spoiling your ballot and doing it in an organized way. It's something you could call it a vote strike. We're not voting, period, end of story. And if it's done on a large enough scale, you could really cause embarrassment to the powers that be. It would become very difficult for them to claim that they had any kind of a mandate from the people. Anyways, that's just the thought I've been having. I really have no more to add on that subject for the time being, but I'm open to any suggestions as to how do we deal with this impoverished set of candidates that we're constantly having to choose from.
Dimitri, we have a few interesting questions. Maybe we could answer them very, very quickly. How does Dimitri feel about receiving the Serena Nashim Award?
So thank you for mentioning that. This was an award that was set up years ago in honor of a journalist, an Iranian journalist by the name of Serena Shim, who was reporting on events in Syria and was killed in very troubling circumstances. I learned of the award being given to me a few days ago. I was honored to receive it. It's also been given to people like Julian Assange and John Pilger and Rania Khalek from Lebanon, who's an excellent journalist. I could go on and on. Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, Ben Norton. So I'm honored to be in their company, and the award apparently is focused on people who according to the selection committee have shown uncompromising integrity in journalism. So I hope people understand that we don't always get things right on Reason to Resist. We all do the best we can, and like anybody, some of our predictions and some of our analysis turns out to be incorrect after the fact. But one thing we will always do is give you the straight goods. We will tell you exactly what our views are. We'll never be influenced by money or external pressures to give you anything other than our honest views and assessment of the situation. So anyways, thank you again to the organizers. If any of them listening, I really appreciate this honor.
Okay, we just have a few more questions. Let's get through them quickly. We have here a question from Balugi the Beluga, who says, Scott Ritter keeps saying how the West is running out of weapons, and yet we see the wars expanding. Any comments on that?
Yeah, it's really hard, for anybody, I think, to say just how badly the weapon stocks of Western countries have been depleted, because there's a lot of secrecy around that issue. But there are indications that they are badly depleted. The Americans just sent a package of weapons to Ukraine, which apparently, were primarily very old weapons from the Vietnam era. It's not even clear that they'll be of any usage whatsoever to the Ukrainian military in this current battle. And of course, we've seen what appears to be a sharp drop in artillery activity on the Ukrainian side ever since the United States started shipping huge amounts of munitions to Israel. It appears that is, that the weapon stocks have become so strained that it is now the Americans have been forced for some time to have to choose between giving weapons to Ukraine and giving weapons to Israel, and they have tended to favor Israel, not surprisingly. So I don't know. I can't really be more granular or precise than that. I think it is a serious problem. I don't know that anybody outside of Western militaries really understands the scope of the problem. But if we continue down this path, it's going to become a very serious problem, if it isn't already, because these wars are escalating.
And Dimitri, even in Canada, we had the Liberal government proposed buying back the weapons of some banned weapons and then shipping them over to to Ukraine. These are not very encouraging signs in terms of weapon supply for Canada. If you're going to resort to taking weapons away from citizens, I mean, I compare that to the equivalent of smoking cigarette butts from the floor that you find on the floor.
I actually wanted you to remind me one thing I want to mention in this regard, Rami. It's important. You know, there was a coup, an attempted coup in South Korea. I guess you could call it a coup. The president who was elected decided he was going to impose martial law, and he was hotly opposed by the South Korean legislature, and I believe he's now been impeached. There's good reason to believe that the reason why he tried to, you know, this is, I would say kind of educated guess, informed speculation, there's not ironclad proof of it, is because the South Korean people are overwhelmingly opposed to the sending of South Korean munitions to Ukraine. And there's some reason to believe that the US government tried to orchestrate the imposition of martial law so that, you know, effectively the South Korean leader could just simply disregard the will of the South Korean people and deliver South Korean weapons to Ukraine. And they've got quite a few of them in South Korea. So that would, you know, support Scott Ritter's suggestion that the West is running out of weapons. The fact that they, you know, possibly resorted to such desperate measures in South Korea to try to get South Korean weapons to Ukraine.
And in a similar note, there are other fronts where we're seeing a lot less American or Western pressure, right? So we're Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. I was quite surprised that these revolutions were able to last this long, and it looks like they'll be able to last much longer, simply because the Americans are stretched thin through trying to keep some sort of strength in trying to oppose China when it comes to Taiwan. In Ukraine, they're flowing as much as they can. So that means that there are other parts of the world where they cannot provide as much support as they would have liked to do so. But carrying over very quickly, there was a question here which says, could Canada even leave NATO?
Great questions today, folks. So in theory, yes, of course, we could. Whether we would be allowed to leave NATO, I really doubt that. I suspect that if any prime minister seriously pursued an exit from NATO on behalf of Canada, that the Americans would do everything possible to see that that person was removed from power. How far they would prepare to go, I don't know, but they certainly would try to squash anybody. Now, that doesn't mean Canada will never get out. It is possible, nonetheless, if you have somebody who's smart enough and courageous enough at the helm of the Canadian government to remove Canada from NATO. But the other way Canada could be removed from NATO is that NATO simply collapses and ceases to exist. And I think there's a very significant chance of that happening following the definitive defeat of the Ukrainian military in this terrible war. That'll be such a blow to NATO. It'll so discredit NATO. Remember also that just before that, the SMO began in February 2022, 3 months earlier, NATO countries departed with their tails between their legs from Afghanistan in a very humiliating way. That was a big blow to NATO's credibility. And now NATO leaders and the United States government are running around telling European countries and Canada they have to jack up their military spending, even though they're deeply in debt and their economies are suffering. So I think NATO's in real trouble, and it may be that events overtake the preferences of the Canadian government, that there's no NATO to be a member of.
So there was a question, can you please interview Pepe Escobar and Colonel Larry Wilkerson? Larry was interviewed already. Pepe Escobar, we're trying. Is Georgia...
Sorry, I haven't interviewed Larry, but those are two good suggestions. Yeah, I will try to line them up. Thank you. Is
Georgia falling for the same trap Ukraine fell for? All started to join the EU. I have an interview lined up this week with a fellow Georgian who's quite has some good insight in the situation in Georgia.
Yeah, Rami, you were in Georgia and did a report for Reason to Resist. So why don't you go ahead and take that one?
Yes. Well, today the president of Georgia, I believe her mandate was supposed to end, and she was supposed to exit power, exit the presidential palace, although it's quite small of a palace. But there was the newly appointed president was supposed to be inaugurated today. The president, Zurabishvili, didn't leave. Didn't exit while her mandate was ending. So now Georgia is in a kind of a deadlock at the moment, where there's basically a president that is overstaying their welcome, and we're going to be monitoring the events as they happen. So I have an interview lined up. Hopefully we will get some better insights than what I could provide to you right now, but things are developing quite quickly. And then, Dimitri, how many last questions can we have? Two more? One more?
Why don't we take two more, and then we'll just briefly talk about what we're going to be doing in the week ahead.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, that one doesn't count, but can you interview Netanyahu? That probably will not very be likely from happening.
Mm-hmm.
But okay.
By the way, I would love to interview Netanyahu, and there's zero chance of that happening. But go ahead.
Okay. So I'm just trying to see about the. Okay. So the question that I have here is, I'm really curious just what Dimitri thinks Russia's role. Sorry, what does Dimitri think of Russia's role in the fall of Syria? Yeah.
It's so difficult to say. You know, I've been in discussions with Laith Marouf, who's based in Beirut, on several occasions since Bashar al-Assad fell, and Laith has consistently expressed the view that Russia basically traded Syria for Ukraine in a backdoor deal. Now, is it possible, in my view, that happened? Yes, it's possible. For a couple of reasons. I think that the Russian Federation is, for reasons that should be obvious, much more concerned about what happens in Ukraine than in Syria. I think they feel that what happens in Ukraine is much more important for Russian national security than Syria. And Russia's president has never purported to prioritize human rights and democracy promotion in foreign countries. He's been pretty clear, as have all the spokespersons of the Russian government, that what the government of Vladimir Putin prioritizes is Russian national security in their foreign policy and multipolarity. So certainly I would think that this Russian government is capable of doing that kind of a deal. And it's one way to interpret what happened. But the problem that I have with that interpretation is that it requires us to believe that Russia trusts Donald Trump to keep his end of that bargain. Bashar al-Assad has been removed from Syria. It is now being carved up. There are forces all over the country that are hostile, very hostile to Bashar al-Assad and to Iran. And there's no realistic prospect of them, of Bashar al-Assad or someone like him being reinstalled in power in Syria anytime soon. So this basically means that Putin, if Laith is correct, agreed to give up on Syria before he had a guarantee that Russia's permanent sovereignty over the areas of Ukraine it occupies would be recognized by the Ukrainian government and by, most importantly, the US government. I just don't think the Russians trust the Americans to that degree, that they would do that kind of a deal. So for that reason, I'm not persuaded that's what happened. Now, another possibility is that, one that I think is more plausible, is that Russia just took a cold hard assessment of what the reality was after years of punishing sanctions on Syria, after years of the United States effectively stealing Syria's wheat and oil in the northeast of the country, the occupation of Idlib by the Turkish forces, the relentless bombardment of Syria year after year by Israel's forces, particularly since the genocide in Gaza began last year. And he said, after consulting with his advisors, if we try to stop the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, we're just going to become embroiled in a quagmire whose outcome will be very uncertain and could jeopardize our ability to achieve our more important objectives in Ukraine. And so basically, he threw up his hands, in my view, and said, "A pox on all your houses. If you all want, you, the Turks, the Americans, and the Israelis, and HTS, if you want to try to sort this out, good luck to you. But we're not going to become embroiled in a quagmire." I think that's more likely what happened here.
And then, so we have one last question, and it's a bit hard to pick since there's a lot of interesting questions being posted in the chat. So let's go with this one for the last one. For Dimitri, are you satisfied with the explanation you got from Ben Norden related to your interview that you did with Ben Norden, I believe a week ago or so, with regards to China being the second biggest trade partner with the Zionists?
Well, just for those who didn't see the interview, thank you for that question, Brian. Just so make sure everybody understands the context. What I asked Ben was, why hasn't China been more assertive in defending the human rights of the Palestinian people? And I think Ben's explanation satisfied me. They have a very, very strong commitment to the principle of non-interference, and he went into the history of that and why China has adopted a strict policy of non-interference. But I disagree with the policy in this particular set of circumstances because, what China is saying is that under the UN Charter, my particular problem with China's policy towards Israel is that it should be imposing very stiff economic sanctions on Israel. And instead, as you've indicated, it's the second largest trading partner of Israel, not far behind the United States. And it hasn't imposed, officially at least, any severe sanctions. So China's explanation is that, unless sanctions are approved by the UN Security Council, they're a violation of the UN Charter. And of course, there's no prospect of the UN Security Council approving sanctions on Israel because the US would veto those sanctions. But as a lawyer, it's my view that and this is something that we're probably going to be arguing about in some litigation that I'm bringing with other lawyers against the Canadian government, that the Genocide Convention is an exception to the requirement under the UN Charter that you have to get UN Security Council approval of sanctions before you implement them. So Article 1 of the Genocide Convention says that all member states, which include China, have an obligation to prevent genocide when there's a material risk of genocide occurring. And in this case, the decision of the International Court of Justice in January of this year, that it was plausible that Israel is committing genocide, leaves no doubt at all, that there is a material risk of genocide occurring. Quite apart from the ICJ's decision, there's a mountain of evidence, expert opinion, that has been developed in the last year that Israel is committing genocide. So I think China has an obligation, as do all states, to impose sanctions on Israel at this time, with or without the approval of the UN Security Council. So I disagree with the Chinese government's interpretation of international law here, but I do understand why they have this position.
Dimitri, that was there's many more questions. One of them, which was, can we have a Q&A episode? And I think with the type of question that we're getting right now, we could probably plan one of those on a quieter week, although it doesn't seem like we're going to have any of those anytime soon.
Well, maybe we could preliminarily plan to have one next week, just subject to unless something crazy happens during the coming week that we have to talk about. But maybe we'll think about that for next Sunday. Thank you for the suggestion. So,
Dimitri, what do we have going on this week?
So tomorrow, I plan to interview Lebanese journalist Hadi Hotait, who lives in Beirut. I interviewed Hadi on my last day in Beirut when I was there in October, and we had a very interesting discussion about the state of the axis of resistance. I'm going to be talking to him about that, and also about what's happening in Syria, because I'm sure he's going to have some very interesting insights into that tragic situation as well. And I'm also going to be asking him about why Iran has not yet retaliated for the last Israeli attack on the territory of Iran, which happened back in October. So I think that's going to be a very interesting discussion. The following day, I'm going to interview somebody who hasn't been on our program before. He lives in Latin America and Central America. His name is Jose Luis Ceja, and he is going to talk to us about the challenges that are going to be confronting Latin America under the second Trump administration. I think you'll have some very interesting insights on that subject. And then on Thursday, the third interview of the week is going to be a gentleman by the name of Professor of Economics, somebody I've known for years. I have tremendous respect for him. His name is Kostas Labavitsas. Kostas was an MP in the first Syriza government that was elected in 2015 in Greece on a promise to relax the austerity program that was being inflicted upon Greece and try to bring it to an end altogether. And that turned out very badly for Syriza, which is basically in a state of collapse now. Costa, in 2015, after being elected as a Syriza MP, 7 or 8 months later, actually resigned and defected to a new party because he was convinced, I think with complete justification, that the Greek government of Alexis Tsipras had betrayed its promise to bring an end to the austerity program. So Costa and I are not going to be talking primarily about Greece in this call. Costa has some very strong views about the state of the global economy, about a massive bubble in the stock markets, about the collapse of the economies of Europe in particular. So that's going to be the focus of our discussion. And he's a really eloquent and insightful person. So I urge you to watch that interview.
And Dimitri, on my end, what basically started as me interviewing a wartime photographer I ended up discovering midway through the interview that Northern Friend, or goes by the name, Arsnikotov, who goes by the name Northern Friend, ended up being a Russian soldier in the front lines of the war in Ukraine. So that was quite an interesting interview, and I'm hoping that we could have it published this week. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be interviewing a couple of Georgian union workers who have a lot to say about EU and American meddling in Georgia and the request in opening a second front against Russia. And so that's the main two things that I have on my end. And as well, I'll possibly be interviewing a good friend of mine called Zaid to speak about the situation. Well, what can we anticipate from Iran vis-a-vis either Trump's re-election or the current situation in West Asia.
Mm-hmm.
How do we end this, Dimitri?
I think with a peace sign. And
it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Everyone, and tune in next Sunday, 4 p.m. on another live stream of Reason to Resist. And please check out our other videos and make sure to subscribe to our channel, to the channel, and to sign up to our Patreon, Substack, and all the good links that we have in the description. Have a nice day, folks.
Thanks, everybody.